October 3, 1953, Springfield, Massachusetts. The last motorcycle rolls off the assembly line at the Indian Motorcycle Company. Not motorcycle. Motorcycle. That was how they spelled it from the beginning, and they never changed it, not in 52 years, not through 2 world wars, not through the Depression, not through every single thing that came before this day. The worker who builds that last machine does not know it is the last one. Nobody told him. The foreman did not come down to the floor and make an announcement. The lights just go off that afternoon, and the doors close, and the oldest motorcycle manufacturer in America is finished. Outside on the street, nobody notices. Springfield has other things to think about. The Korean War ended 3 months ago. Eisenhower is in the White House. The suburbs are being built. America is moving forward, buying cars, building highways, dreaming of a future that looks nothing like the past. Inside that factory, on a floor that smells like oil and metal, and 50 years of the same work, done the same way by men whose fathers did it before them, the machines go quiet. And the greatest American motorcycle brand that ever existed dies without a eulogy. I am going to tell you why. I am going to tell you the real reason Indian is gone, and I promise you it is not the reason most people think. It is not because the motorcycles were bad. It is not because the riders stopped wanting them. It is not because the Japanese arrived and took the market. The Japanese arrived in America in 1959, 6 years after Indian was already dead in the ground. Indian Motorcycle was killed before any of that. It was killed by something that had nothing to do with engines or riders or the open road. It was killed by men in suits who saw a profitable company and decided to take it apart for the money inside it. It was killed by Wall Street, by acquisition and debt, and the specific cruelty of people who understand balance sheets but have never once felt what it means to sit on a machine that was built to carry you somewhere. Stay with me through this entire story, because the end of it is not what you expect, and the part that comes just before the end is the part that will make you angry. It made me angry the first time I understood what actually happened. It still does. Let's go back to where it started. It is 1897, Springfield, Massachusetts. A 16-year-old boy named George Hendee is already one of the most famous bicycle racers in America. He is fast, and he knows it, and the crowds know it too. He has won national championships. He has been on the front page of sporting papers. At 16 years old, George Hendee is the kind of athlete that a small New England city builds its identity around, the local boy who went out into the wider world and came back with trophies. He retires from racing at 22. He is not injured, not burned out. He is practical. He can see that the money in cycling is not in riding, it is in selling, and he starts a company to import and sell bicycles under the name Hendee Manufacturing. He is good at it. He understands what riders want because he was one. He understands what makes a machine trustworthy because he has tested machines to their limits on a racetrack. He understands the difference between a bicycle built to hold together and a bicycle built to fall apart after a season, and he knows which one his customers will come back for. By 1900, he is watching the new thing with the same careful attention he gave to racing. The motorized bicycle. The machine with an engine. He sees what it can do. He sees what it cannot do yet, and he starts thinking about the man who could help him build one properly. That man is Oscar Hedstrom. A Swedish-born engineer who had immigrated to America as a child, who had grown up speaking 3 languages and thinking in none of them, who understood mechanical systems the way musicians understand music, intuitively, completely, with a certainty that did not require explanation. Hedstrom had been building motor-paced bicycles for racing, machines with small engines used to pace human riders in endurance events. He knew what a small engine needed to be reliable. He knew what a frame needed to do to keep the engine working over real terrain. Hendee found him in 1900. They talked, they agreed. By 1901 they had built their first machine. They called it the Indian. Not as in the country, as in the original inhabitants of the continent, the native people whose imagery was already being used across American commercial life as a symbol of something ancient and wild and distinctly of this land. They put a headdress on the logo. They made the machine red. They gave it a name that could not be confused with anything European. That first machine was not perfect. Early motorcycles never were. But it worked reliably in a way that other motorized bicycles of that era did not. Hedstrom understood reliability, the way engineers who have been humiliated by failure understand it. Every weak point he found in testing, he fixed before production. Every failure mode he could anticipate, he designed around. The result was a machine that riders could trust on roads that were, in 1901, not built for machines of any kind. The orders came in. 2 in the first year, then 8, then hundreds. By 1905, Indian was the largest motorcycle manufacturer in the United States. By 1913, it was the largest in the world. The factory in Springfield was building 20,000 motorcycles a year, which in 1913 is a number that seems impossible until you understand that the world had not yet fallen in love with the automobile, that the motorcycle was still a serious tool of transportation for working men across Europe and America, and that the Indian in red was the machine they wanted. George Hendee understood marketing before anyone used that word in the way we use it now. He understood that a race win on a Sunday translated directly into sales on a Monday. He sent Indian riders to every major competition in America and England and Europe. He hired the best mechanics in Springfield to prepare the racing machines. And the results came back to the showroom floor. Indian wins, Indian sells. On June 10, 1911, 3 Indian riders finished first, second, and third in the Isle of Man Tourist Trophy, the most prestigious motorcycle race in the world, run on the roads of a small island in the Irish Sea, watched by riders and manufacturers from every country where motorcycles were being built. First, second, and third, all Indian, all red, all Springfield, Massachusetts. The telegram that arrived at the Indian factory that evening was pinned to the wall in the main office and stayed there for years. And I want you to remember that telegram. Remember that wall. Remember what it meant for the men who worked in that factory to walk past it every morning. Because I am going to tell you about the day when everything that telegram represented was handed to men who had never seen a race, never built an engine, and had no idea what they were holding. That day is coming, and when it arrives, the fall is going to be so fast it will leave you breathless. This is the Indian that people remember when they talk about what the company was. This is the machine that Hendee built and Hedstrom engineered, and the workers in Springfield assembled by hand over the course of years when the motorcycle was not yet a symbol of anything except transportation and competition. Before it became freedom. Before it became a lifestyle. When it was still just a machine that a man needed to get where he was going. But here is what you need to hold on to as I tell you the next part of this story. George Hendee and Oscar Hedstrom were not businessmen in the modern sense. They were a promoter and an engineer. They were magnificent at what they did. What they could not do, what neither of them had been trained to do, what the success of the early years never required them to learn to do, was protect the company they had built from the kind of men who would eventually want to take it from them. Those men arrived in 1916. The first one was a Chicago industrialist named Frank Weschler, who bought into the company through a proxy investment and began pushing for expansion at a pace that Hendee thought was reckless. Weschler understood volume. He understood that more motorcycles meant more revenue. What he did not understand or did not care about was that more motorcycles also meant diluted quality control if the factory floor was not managed with the same care that Hedstrom had always brought to it. Oscar Hedstrom resigned in 1913. The official reason given was health. The real reason, as anyone who worked near the executive level at Indian in those years understood, was that the company was changing in ways that Hedstrom could not accept. The decisions being made above him were no longer engineering decisions. They were financial decisions, made by men who looked at a motorcycle and saw a unit sold, not a machine that a real person was going to ride on a real road in all weather and depend on not to fail them. Without Hedstrom, the engineering culture that had made Indian dominant began to erode, slowly at first. The machines that came out of Springfield in the mid-1910s were still good, better than most of what else was available, but the margin that Hedstrom had always maintained, the small extra distance between what was necessary and what he actually built in, began to close. George Hendee held on until 1916. Then he sold his shares and stepped away. He was 54 years old. He had built the largest motorcycle company in the world from nothing in 15 years. He walked out of the Springfield factory for the last time and went home to the house he had bought from the proceeds of a career in racing and 2 decades of building something remarkable. What he left behind was now in other hands. The years after the First World War were complicated for Indian in ways that were not obvious from the outside. The factory had spent the war years building motorcycles for the military, which was profitable, but which had also required retooling and redirecting resources in ways that were hard to undo once peacetime returned. The civilian market had changed during those years. The automobile had become more affordable. Henry Ford's production line had done what it was designed to do, and the working man who might have bought a motorcycle in 1910 now had reason to consider a car instead. Indian responded by doubling down on what it did best. Racing. Engineering. The Scout, introduced in 1920, was arguably the finest lightweight motorcycle produced anywhere in the world at that moment. Fast, reliable, beautiful in the particular way that machines designed without compromise tend to be beautiful. The 4, introduced in 1927, was an engineering statement, 4 cylinders in a row. Smooth and powerful and unlike anything else available in the American market. But the management structure above the engineering floor was unstable. Ownership changed hands multiple times through the 1920s. Each new owner brought different priorities, different pressure, different ideas about what Indian needed to be. The company that Hendee and Hedstrom had built with a clear and unified vision was now being pulled in several directions at once by men who agreed only that it should be profitable and disagreed about nearly everything else. The Depression arrived in 1929 and it nearly killed Indian, the same way it nearly killed Harley-Davidson, the same way it actually killed every other American motorcycle manufacturer. But Indian survived the Depression. Barely. With production cuts and salary cuts and the specific stubbornness of a company that has been through hard times before and believes it will come through again. The Second World War saved them in the short term, the same way the First World War had. Military contracts, guaranteed orders, a reason to keep the factory running. Indian built the 741, a simplified version of the Scout for military use, tens of thousands of them. The machines went to Allied armies across Europe and the Pacific. They worked. They were not the most sophisticated thing Indian had ever built, but they were honest machines that did what they were asked to do in conditions that asked a great deal. When the war ended in 1945, Indian had money in the bank, a factory that was running, and a domestic market that was about to reopen. Men were coming home. Men who had spent years on motorcycles in military service, men who knew how to ride and who were young enough to want something with a throttle instead of a steering wheel. The post-war moment was exactly the opportunity that Indian needed. And then Ralph Rogers arrived. Stop here for a second, because I told you at the beginning of this video that Indian was killed by Wall Street, and some of you might have been thinking, surely it is more complicated than that, surely there were other factors, surely it was not simply one man or one decision. And you are right that it was not one man or one decision. What it was is something more specific and more damning than that. It was a pattern. The same pattern, repeated by different men over 15 years, each one arriving with different language and different intentions and producing the same result. You will see it clearly in the next few minutes. Stay with me. Ralph Rogers was a businessman. He was not a rider. He was not an engineer. He was a man who understood investments and acquisitions and the theory of modernizing industrial companies. And in 1945 he acquired a controlling interest in Indian Motorcycle through a holding company and installed himself as president. Rogers believed that Indian's future was not in big, heavy American V-twins. He believed the future was in lightweight motorcycles, the kind that had been popular in England and Europe, smaller and cheaper and more accessible to the broader market he was trying to reach. He was not entirely wrong about the market. He was catastrophically wrong about the execution. He commissioned a series of new lightweight models and contracted their production partly to outside suppliers, rather than building everything in Springfield. The results were machines that had the Indian name and none of the Indian quality. The engines were underpowered. The reliability was not there. The riders who bought them, expecting what the Indian name had always meant, came back to the dealers with complaints that the dealers could not fix because the problems were in the design, not the maintenance. The damage to the brand was immediate and severe. Indian had spent 50 years building a reputation for reliability that was as sturdy as anything the factory produced. Ralph Rogers spent 3 years destroying it. Not intentionally, not maliciously, simply through the specific incompetence of a man who understood balance sheets and did not understand motorcycles, making decisions that required him to understand motorcycles. By 1948, Rogers was out. The damage was done. The loyal customers who had ridden Indians their entire lives had experienced machines that failed them, and the new customers who might have become loyal had walked away before the relationship began. The company limped through the end of the 1940s under new management, trying to recover ground that had been lost in ways that were not entirely recoverable. The big twins, the Chief and the Scout, still had their followers. There were still men in America who wanted an Indian and would wait as long as it took to get one, but the financial structure of the company had been weakened by years of bad decisions. The capital that should have been available for engineering and development had been spent on the failed lightweight project, and the bank relationships that a healthy company takes for granted had become fragile. In 1950, an English company called Brockhouse Engineering purchased Indian. The idea, as presented to the remaining Indian dealers and the motorcycle press, was that British capital and manufacturing expertise would stabilize the company and fund the development of new models. What actually happened was that Brockhouse used the Indian name to import British motorcycles and sell them through the Indian dealer network as Indian-badged machines. The riders who walked into an Indian dealership expecting to buy an American motorcycle built in Springfield left with a British motorcycle that had an Indian logo bolted onto it. The dealers understood what was happening. The loyal customers understood what was happening. The motorcycle press understood what was happening. Everyone who had any connection to what Indian actually was understood that the brand was being hollowed out, that the name was being used as a distribution channel by people who had no interest in what the name had meant. The sales collapsed. The dealers closed, one by one, across the country. The men who had staked their livelihoods on the Indian franchise, who had built their businesses around the expectation that the machines they sold were the machines their customers came back to the following year, expecting to service and upgrade and replace, found themselves without a product worth selling and without the financial runway to survive until something better came along. And on October 3rd, 1953, the factory in Springfield went quiet. The machines on the floor were not finished. The orders that had been placed by the remaining dealers were not filled. The workers who came in that morning expecting to do what they had always done found the doors locked. The announcement, when it came, was brief. The Indian Motorcycle Company was ceasing operations. The assets would be liquidated. The workers went home. The dealers absorbed the loss. The riders who had been waiting for their machines waited for nothing. And the factory on Wilbraham Road in Springfield, Massachusetts, the place where George Hendee and Oscar Hedstrom had built the first Indian in 1901, went silent in a way that it has never entirely recovered from. Here is what I want you to sit with for a moment, because this is the part that does not make it into the short version of this story. When Indian died in 1953, it did not die because the motorcycle was obsolete. The Chief, the big V-twin that was the company's flagship machine in the final years, was still the most refined and comfortable American motorcycle available. The riders who owned them loved them with the specific devotion that riders have for machines that genuinely do what machines are supposed to do. When the supply of new Indian parts finally dried up in the years after the factory closed, there were men across America who paid fabricators to manufacture replacement parts out of their own pockets, who kept their Indians running through decades of mechanical improvisation, who refused to accept that the machine was over even after the company was gone. That is not the behavior of people who had been disappointed. That is the behavior of people who were faithful to something real. What Indian had was not the problem. What Indian had was extraordinary. What Indian lacked in the final years was leadership that understood what it had. Men who could look at the Chief and see not just a unit to be sold, but a machine to be protected. Men who could look at the brand and understand that it carried 50 years of earned trust. And that earned trust is not a line item on a balance sheet. You cannot see it in a quarterly report, but you can destroy it in a single season of bad decisions, and you can never fully get it back. Ralph Rogers did not set out to destroy Indian. He set out to modernize it. The outcome was the same. The men at Brockhouse did not set out to hollow out the brand. They set out to use it as a distribution channel. The outcome was the same. The workers in the Springfield factory, the ones who had built Scouts and Chiefs and the machines that finished first, second, and third at the Isle of Man in 1911, did not choose what happened. It was chosen for them by men who were never in the factory, who never smelled the oil, who never heard the engine start on a cold morning, who never understood that what they were holding was not an asset to be extracted, but a living thing to be kept alive. That is what Wall Street does to things it does not understand, not through cruelty, through indifference, through the application of financial logic to situations that require something other than financial logic, through the appointment of men whose skill set is exactly wrong for the problem in front of them. Indian Motorcycle deserved better. The workers deserved better. The riders who had been faithful to that red machine for half a century deserved better. And the American motorcycle industry, which would spend the next 30 years being reshaped by the Japanese manufacturers that Indian might have been strong enough to resist, deserved better. The lights went out in Springfield on October the 3rd, 1953. The floor went quiet, the doors closed. And somewhere in America that afternoon, a man on a red Indian Chief with a headdress on the tank and a throttle in his right hand was riding a road that he did not know yet would never produce another machine like the one under him. He would find out eventually. They all did, and none of them ever fully accepted it.